It's a great pleasure today to be able to introduce our colleague from the Faculty of Humanities, Alessandro Launaro. He is Professor of Roman Archaeology and a Fellow of King's College as well. Alessandro has been, since 2010, I think it is, working with Martin Millet in the British School at Rome. Now I think you're probably the head man, aren't you?
Well, yeah.
Take compliment. Take compliment. In an extraordinary excavation project at the town of Interamna Lirenas in south of Lazio, I guess, between the Via Latina and the Via Appia on the river Live. A site that I saw on Wikipedia, perhaps you wrote the entry, I don't know. It says on Wikipedia that it's a very unpromising town. The pottery discovered there was not up to much, and nobody took notice of it. But the Cambridge project that you've been instrumental in leading has started to reveal all sorts of much more interesting things about this Roman city, which we're going to hear about in the talk today. And I think, must say, I'm particularly delighted you come to speak to the Centre for Studies of Classical Architecture about it, because of course, the buildings you've been discovering are very architectural buildings, public buildings indeed, as well as domestic buildings. And I also would like to just say that Alessandro says in his online research profile that he's very interested in the intersection of archaeology and text effectively. So again, that's something we're particularly keen on, materiality and text and the interaction of those two things. So we're much looking forward to hearing what you tell us about this unpromising, but turns out very promising site.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So, hello everyone. So, for me, this is a very great opportunity because I try to tailor the presentation for an audience from whom I hope to get a lot of feedback and advice on how better to approach some of the evidence that we have, how better to interpret it and make better sense of it. So some of the things that I'll show you also look ugly and possibly wrong. Please do not hesitate to point it out. Now, the Roman world, and I need to start there because we need to start big, was a world of cities. You've heard it probably many, many times, about 2,000 cities. So an urbanized civilization. Cities were part of the ordinary experience of people, the majority of whom lived in the countryside, fair enough, but they engaged with a built environment a lot. Places like Pompeii, 66 hectares, 10,000 inhabitants, some people say even 20,000. Ostia, 150 hectares, it has been doubled recently, and more than 50,000 people. Tingad, Northern Africa, 50 hectares, 10,000 inhabitants, some of the best sites you may come across, and they provide us with a comprehensive, holistic understanding of how Roman towns may look like. How representative are they, though? Because your average Roman town was about 20, 30 hectares, and has not been excavated or is known in anything remotely as comprehensive a way as these other sites that I mentioned. Here is the very important town of Mintune, only 28 hectares, maybe 2,100 people, inhabitants, less, only known as most of the sites that you may visit outside of the kind of those that I mentioned, primarily known around the Forum. Okay, the center, monumental area that drew the attention of scholars and antiquaries when they wanted to look for inscriptions to the really nice buildings. This is what I think makes Interamna quite an interesting case study, because it's your middle range, middle place in the hierarchy Roman town that is known comprehensively. It's one of the very few. I can think of a couple of those. You will tell me if I'm missing something. Where are we? As Frank was saying, we are between Rome and Naples in southern Lazio, along the river Liris, which was a major communication route across this part of central Italy. This is the site. Look at the Roman town. There is an excavation now, but nothing can be seen. I mean, beautiful countryside, no doubt, but very little in the way of visible archaeological remains, to the point that for a long time, this site was not even understood as a proper town, a town-only name. Basically a village, but imperial period, probably abandoned later on, declining, not very much going on. And that's the reason why you don't see it very much. The aerial photograph shows you what the site looks like from above. We are very near the River Liri. There was a road actually that passed through here, representing the backbone. That was the Via Latina, a very important communication route before the Via Appia, between Rome and Campania. Okay, the Via Appia passed through marshes, basically. They had to be, turned into an area that you could travel across before, and it required a lot of infrastructure. Whereas the Via Latina, which doesn't bear the name of a Roman magistrate, traces its history back to prehistory. It was the route through Latium, and it still existed in Roman time. But at the intersection, we should say, with the River Liris, so it was very much strategically located. Originally, in order to contain the threat of the Samnites, but later on, strategically located in relation to the communication network, which will be the secret to the success of this town in the long term. It lays on a plateau with steep sides over two little streams. And it was part of a network of towns. It was very well connected. Please keep that in mind. The project started in 2010, not as an excavation as it happens, but as a geophysical survey. And we started it together with Martin Millett, my colleagues, and a lot of what you're gonna hear comes from conversation, discussions that we've had over the years as we're running this project. Different phases, different times, we did different things. And that puts us in a position to have quite a comprehensive view of the site. Rare, if not unique. If you want to know more about it, it's online, open access. You can get the plan, go down and look for the things you may be interested in. Now, what have we done? The town was established in 312 BC, okay, as a colony, that is partly relevant. And was occupied, we know now, until basically the 6th century, 900 years, a long history. You cannot see anything on the surface. What we did is that we applied different techniques of geophysical prospection. You basically, try to detect anomalies in the subsoils, in the qualities and the physical qualities of what is buried, and that allows you, according to the technique that you're applying, microphotometry first, this is ground penetrating radar, to get an image. This is the thing that allowed us to cover 24 hectares, well, actually nearly 25 hectares of surface across the site. Courtesy of the University of Ghent, and this gentleman here is Lieven Verdonk, who really went up and down like a scanner, although spending a lot of time. It was burned, badly burned. Now, this is what we got in the end. It looks like, you cannot make much of that, but if you get nearer, you start seeing more, and you start recognizing shapes and familiar plans or buildings, some of which are pretty obvious, some of which may be less obvious, but others houses, okay? And you can start to say, well, this is a plot, this is a plot, this is a plot. And we were able to, therefore, to identify the distribution of different sorts of buildings in town. Clearly, the majority of houses of different sizes, different status, from very big to relatively small, possibly even apartment blocks, a later development, probably mid to late imperial period. Some areas that you can see here in orange, I'll go back to that. Possibly terraced sanctuaries, a lot of warehouses, which tells you something about this town. It was, in his own way, it was a little Ostia. It was a trading hub, linked with the port and the river. It was a place where, they were basically intercepting the flow of trade that moved from what was basically one of the richest countryside in Italy, celebrated by the agronomists, by Cato, by Varro, who lived nearby, I had a villa nearby, as the quintessential Roman countryside, and the rest of the Mediterranean through the port of the town that I showed you at the beginning, Minturna. And being located on the river was great, at the crossing of two major routes. 3 bath complexes, aptly highlighted in blue, and then several green buildings that we identified as public of some kind. And I will get to that in due course. 23 hectares within the walls, possibly 2,000 inhabitants. I'm not saying that this is the average Roman town, but I'm telling you this is the middle range, mid-size, mid-position in the hierarchy Roman town. How representative is this of every other Roman town? Difficult to say, but certainly more than Pompeii, Ostia, and Tingalt. That is the point that I'm trying to make. One thing that we did is that we surveyed the surface of this town, and given that the site, as you saw, is being plowed, a lot of materials comes to the surface, and we can study the material, the pottery that Frank was referring to, and especially the study of the kind of pottery that normally doesn't elicit the greatest possible enthusiasm, commonware pottery, if I were to show it to you, if I had a plate with a tray with your standard Roman pottery, shiny red, shiny black, you would be immediately attracted to that. If I were to show you commonware pottery, say, I have that in my garden. And people, when we started doing this, the people from the Superintendenza Italian Archaeological Office were really, really skeptical. And we're skeptical to the point they say, do what you want, but at the end of each season, we're going to rebuild it because we don't want that drop to fill our warehouses. Space is limited. And that scared us to the point that we decided by the end of each season, we would have studied everything. Drawn everything, because actually we bought the thread. We said, no, we're going to do it then. They never did it. They never did it. And in fact, because of the work we did, they realized the potential. I mean, it's not that they didn't know about commonware, but they didn't quite appreciate that all that effort eventually would have yielded some results and allowed us to see a level of continuity in this town that otherwise we would have not seen. Because that is the problem with the main classes of pottery. What you see is primarily the early phases of the occupation of these sites, okay, up until the early imperial period. But afterwards, unsurprisingly, you don't see a lot of this for reasons that we can discuss. And given that you're not finding this nice pottery, you start saying, well, everything was falling apart. People didn't know how to eat or drink anymore. They weren't using all the right kind of vessels. By looking at commonware pottery, we're able not only to say that actually to map more clearly the earlier phase of the site, but to see its continuity well into the 3rd century. And actually to map its continuity up to a point, you see it's contracting well into the 6th. Now, when you superimpose this to the kind of map that I showed you before, that allows you to tell the story of a town comprehensively, in a way that is not normally possible for towns of this size, hence the uniqueness. Then, of course, we wanted to dig, because then, it's fun, the rest, but this is even more. And we went deep. These are the foundations of the basilica. They are 2.1 meters. We were not really very interested in this at this point. We're interested in this building that we're still studying and spending the best part of my sabbatical leave this term looking at this. It's an earlier building. We're not really talking very much in this presentation about it, although I'm very happy to answer any question you may have. Excavation allows us to do something at depth, literal, but also chronological and detailed, so that we could better understand what was going on. Now, we live in the best of worlds in the case of Interamna, because usually when you have a trench and an excavation, you don't necessarily know what happens beyond. So you see, usually there is a wall that goes into the section of your trench, and then God knows where it goes. We know. I know exactly where these walls go. So that allows us to contextualize the buildings, not only in its immediate context, but also in its broader context, the town. And given that we know the history of the town, we can see how the language of urbanism and architecture was deployed at every turn of the story in order to convey, express the identity of the people that were living here. Hence the title of the presentation. Now, let's start talking about this town. First of all, the layout. Very regular, unsurprising, given we're talking about the Romans. But technically, although people make a lot, especially in the past, used to make a lot about the grid, the quintessential sign of Romanism. Apart from the fact that even in the ancient world, they knew that it came from the Greek world, but in fact, you find it appearing in very different contexts at about the same time, the 5th, 4th century BC. You find it in Carthaginian Punic context, like in Panormos, modern-day Palermo, in Sicily. You find it in Carthage itself, well before the Romans. You find it in the Greek world. You find it in the Etruscan world. There is another site, better known, that is Marzabotto, and you find it used in every foundation that the Romans established, across Italy and then beyond. Now, it's not a sign of Romanism, and that is something that I want to point out at the beginning, the people living in Interamna, although technically a colony founded by the Romans, did not consider themselves Romans. They were not even Roman citizens. Even if they came from Rome, they stopped being Roman, they became citizens of Interamna Lirenas, which was a city-state. By definition, ally of the Romans, fair enough, but they were their own people. Up until later on, when Roman citizenship became the thing, and therefore they became Roman citizens, but that wasn't until the 1st century BC. Okay, so for the first couple of centuries, They didn't consider themselves Roman. And in fact, we know that when Hannibal invaded Italy with the elephants, etc., by then probably they had died. But by the time he was passing through the valley, they kind of sent an embassy together with similar other settlements to Rome, saying, "We had it, enough, stop. We're not playing anymore. You're on your own." To which the Senate had to reply, "But you're like sons to us, and you owe us the love and respect of that sons owe to parents." Now it's an interesting, and we couldn't care less. For them, the future of Interamna Lirenas was a future in which the Roman Republic didn't exist. Tough. But this is to tell you what, that the way it was laid out was not to make it look like a Roman town. The way it was laid out was to apply a technology in the laying out of towns that made perfect sense. This is a world where houses tend to have a squarish plan. And the reason why they tend to have a squarish plan, they have often gable roofs, which use square tiles. So, if you want to fit several houses, you will end up having squarish blocks. And this is a good way of organizing space. So, did they look at this and say, "Oh, it looks like Rome"? They didn't say that for two reasons. They couldn't care less, and it didn't look like Rome, which grew organically from a village, whereas this was established as a colony. But for us, very interesting, after this, was the pattern of the plots. You saw that I used different colors to identify different plots of different building units, we call them, right? And what we find is that there are some regularities. So although these are the final result of a process in which someone bought part of the plot of their neighbors, built a larger house, some of these plots may be in requisition to build a public building, but normally you see that the insula is divided often in the middle, and except for the front along the Via Latina, where it is divided in three. And then we started looking at the presence of walls, and what we found is that there is a very much a regular scheme in place of two types of plots. Technically three if you take into account this, but the green one have the same front as the blue one. Along the main road, and now we know even on the other side of the forum, the houses are bigger. And then away from it, they are smaller. Why? Because inequality is a thing for them. It's obvious from day one that we are divided in social classes. I mean, we give them names: equites and pedites, cavalrymen and infantrymen. Now, because they had to fight as such, this is a time in which no professional army existed. Every citizen is a baker during the day, and God forbid, if we need to go to war, everyone has their own, armor and weapons in the attic, and they go fighting. They were organized according to their census, to their wealth, and therefore their ability to buy the right kind of equipment to serve in the army. And that is why they were divided in at least two classes: the infantrymen, probably subdivided in other ways, and the aristocracy. But from day one. And unsurprisingly, you find that the most important houses are located along the main road and along the forum, which is not something completely new, because had already been suggested for another similar colony, which is Cosa. We're in Tuscany, in Etruria technically. And where we find a similar reconstruction based, however, on very limited information, mostly from few excavations, that says that along the most important road, you have larger houses, and along secondary roads, you have smaller ones. What have I done? Sorry, my apologies. Now, what is important to remember here is that you see, because this will change soon, the center of the town is what is really important. And, elite houses seems to be gravitating around the spaces. However, we're talking about plots rather than houses, because the town was probably not entirely occupied in its early phases. What they do is that the learned surveyors, the agrimensores, probably come, divide the plots, put pegs in the ground, do the whole thing. But because of the early history, problematic history of the settlement, they don't have the time to get all the colonies coming, all of their families. At some point, they even put under siege earlier on by the Samnites, and they are taken captives. I mean, the early history of Interamna is a disaster. And that may explain why not the whole area had been occupied. But war ends, peace comes, and Interamna finds ideally located at the center of this network, an intersecting wealth, which puts it in the position to, increase its monumentality. And interestingly, we found early evidence of this from the excavation and possibly through the geophysical survey. Underneath the theater, we found underneath the floor of the crypta, which is basically the corridor, the covered corridor that goes around the theater, we found what remains of this is the foundation, this is the main structure in opus quadratum. On this side, you have basically the steps, and you cannot see it here very clearly, but this is the base of a pilaster, of a column, right? Of a porticus. Now, exactly where it goes, we know now that it doesn't go that way. So possibly, if it's doing this game, like a porticus on seaside, it's not open towards the Via Latina, but in fact opening on the other side. Yeah, it's creating a kind of terrace. We don't know exactly for what it was used, but it does date to the early 2nd century BC, which is when you start seeing these sort of things in Rome and in nearby in Turkey. So this is a similar sign of, and it doesn't seem to be an example of something coming from Rome and being copied locally, but rather the same people being exposed to the same fashions across the Mediterranean, coming back home, and at the same time as the Romans are doing that in Rome, they do it in Minturno and then do it in Interamna. How is that? Because by virtue of being allies of Rome, they were fighting the same wars. Actually, Italians represented the allies, the majority of the armies of the Romans. Don't think the legions were possibly 1/3. The rest were the allied contingents. And they went into the east, they saw things, they saw the Greek store, and they say, why should we have it? We won with money now. And in the same style, we think, they may have come back with an interesting, not novelty, but something that was very fashionable in the Greek world at this time, the terrace sanctuary. A terrace sanctuary because actually the same kind of rugged landscape where you have a slope could be turned into a nice terrace with a temple or an altar in the middle. And although interpretation of this is, I don't know, but with this, I'm ready to go to a conference and say, well, I think we got it. What we have here is possibly a portico on 3 sides on a terrace. We have what looks like either an altar or a temple with a stairway in the front on a high platform where it is left. And that, I think, is in keeping with a with a fashion and architectural type that they copy from the Greek world. They need to be exposed to that. They need to be connected enough to see that. This building here, as well as the porticos, however, look outside. They're on the margin of the settlement. Whereas at the beginning, I showed you the road and the forum were the center of gravitation. Now this town is projecting to the outside towards what? The roads. People bypassing the town need to see the town. They cannot escape that. There is this kind of scenographic sense. Now, the town clearly draws attention, is on the rise, and draws the attention of very powerful people. This is one of the things that we like the most, because there was this inscription that, very fragmentary, but turns out that before this, the scholars from the 1800s could look at it, a land surveyor who was working for the Abbey of Monte Cassino, while he was having, I don't know, some kind of merenda, some kind of break, found an inscription in the courtyard of a farmer and bothered to copy it. And that provides us the complete text of the inscription that tells us that actually Julius Caesar was the patronus of the Municipio. To which immediately people say, whoa, what an extraordinary sight. No, because we know that Caesar was patronus of other relatively small, middle-ranging sites. We primarily know through inscriptions. It's not something that you read about in Livy or major historians. It's 46 BC. Less than 2 years from now, it will be killed. It needs to hold in place, well, it needs to hold Italy, basically, and creates this level of bilateral alliance with these communities. And the inhabitants of Interamna take this increased visibility, so they start a career possibly in the Senate, and we have this wonderful sundial, which we found not far from the theater, not in the place where it was. They were trying to drag it away to build something else after the site had been abandoned, but then realized that you cannot build very much with it, so they abandoned it. Good for us, because it tells us the name of a guy. The Novi are a local family, but it tells us that, apart from the fact that he paid with his own money, good for him, but he was a plebeian tribune. And at that point, that magistracy could not be in the town, because at this point they had become all Roman citizens. This was a plebeian tribune in Rome. So this is the sign of someone that is starting the senatorial career in Rome. Interamna, at this point, is playing the game. And we know now that a close collaborator of Claudius, one of the arch enemies of Cicero, came from Interamna. You know, all the time people were thinking, well, coming from another Interamna, because this was not important. Turns out that it makes no sense with the distance that you say you get to cover in order to get to Rome. There are the two Interamnas in Italy. It means in between rivers, it's like say Newcastle, okay, there are several in the UK. And the thing is, what we have here, bringing all the elements, is the history of a community on the rise. And again, architecture may show that. Here's the area where I will be focusing on. And the way we frame it is really kind of a celebration. The town needs to show off. They have the resources, they have the visibility, they have the right friends. And it becomes now the time to really increase even further the profile of this very little town, the theater. Now, we haven't excavated all of the rooms, only some of those, and this was used as a dump when the town was abandoned. It took us ages to go through it, and we all every time said, oh, we found the floor, oh, we found the floor, oh, we found the floor. There were the wheelbarrows of taking out the roof, basically the debris from buildings that had been knocked down. Okay, so after that, the superintendents wanted the process to be sped up, rightfully. Those of you, and I think many in the public who know anything about theater immediately will notice there is something weird. And they didn't run out of money, and that is why they don't have the full circle. There is something else at play. Okay, so the building, these are the dimension, has a main hall, okay? And then it's surrounded by a corridor, which is the crypta. The crypta is there to basically, it was closed, so there was no colonnade, there was a continuous wall with semicolons on the outside, brickwork, an opus verticulatum, and it was a kind of reception place. And here, which was a bit wider, was the space for the actors to get prepared before, through these accesses, they got onto the stage, which is this area here, okay? Is a bit wider because of that. All of this could be closed with doors. We found the signs on the thresholds. Okay, so once the play started, all was sealed. Now, this is a theater according to Vitruvius. And Vitruvius was very far from the practice of building theaters because there are many examples that more or less correspond to his what is advice, right? This is last point. Now, interestingly, you see the whole the main feature is that the line of the pulpitum of the stage is basically, and at the intersection of this line with the main axis, what you have is the generator, the point of origin of the curve of the entire structure. Okay, so you have a full semicircle, which you don't have here. Now, what you have is that the main curve of the theater and the radial walls does originate instead along the line of the scaena. So it's squeezed. Okay, the walls of the what improperly we call aditus maximi, probably we should call for what they were, parodoi, actually has a completely different point of origin, and that's because otherwise you would have not been able to enter, because you would have cut through a wall, and which is a bit further away. But the foundations, which we are able to find here, the circular foundations, and underneath this floor, are actually centered on the middle of the scaena. So the point of origin shifts. We are still wondering whether, in this case, there was a change in the project midway, whether actually they were trying to solve a problem of retaining the hill, because we are built along the slope. There are several explanations, but basically, compared to where things should be, they've been moved around. Now, the reason for that is probably given by these 8 pilasters. 23.2 meters, it's not unheard of for a roof. Because what you have here, given the reconstruction, but based on what you have, is a roof theater. Don't haste to call it an odeum. The Romans would have called it theatrum tectum. And the idea, oh yes, it was for singing performances, for music, only because of the, that is the odeum of Pericles in maybe in Athens, but technically it is a theater with a roof on top, which has many advantages. We found, digging around here, plenty of architectural terracottas belonging to a roof. This one's my wife, it's probably online, told me, oh, I shouldn't show them because she's not very sure that they actually belong to the theater itself and not come from a later down. But this one is missing the lower jaw. It was part probably of a roof anyway was to allow the water out. And we have around the theater, you may have noticed, a gutter around to collect rainwater. Guess the way it would have looked is so unique. No, because at about the same time in the Julio-Claudian period, you find this in places like Augusta Pretoria, the best preserved probably. It also still has the wall. I wanted to visit this summer, it's under restoration. And I went all the way to Augusta, however. And this one from the place where I come from, Luna as well. And they're all Julio-Claudian, they are a later development. And there are more or less 100 theaters known in Italy from the Greco-Roman period. About 10 that probably have a roof. So the people in Interamna Lirenas, when they commissioned this, they knew that every single town around had their own theater, and they're way bigger than this. This could at most host 1,500 people. My apologies. But it was fit for the size of the town. Didn't require them to, they could have covered it, and covering it would have its own advantages. Protection from the environment, better acoustics, was reverberating sounds, to the point it has been suggested that this kind of structures needed very large windows, not only to let air in and light in, otherwise people would have stopped 1,500 people here after a while. You can imagine the microclimate that they would have generated, but also to let some of the sound, a modicum of sound out. So this is our understanding of how the theater may have looked like. It had been added, it dates to the Julio-Claudian period because I think we started in the time of Augustus, so late 1st century BC, but it takes some time to take its final form because you can tell the columnatio here, they don't bond, it is abutting to it. And the reason for that is that it's a later gift. Maybe at the end someone, well, I think we know who, put the money in, and we found plenty of evidence that has been used to reconstruct this facade, and it is the work of this former student of mine, Daniel Grunwald. And what he found is that this, whoever paid for this managed to get marbles from all over the Mediterranean. Colored marbles, also white. Quite an investment, especially for a town that has very little in terms of other goods imported. So this is someone that actually is using their connection to get material that otherwise you may not find as easily, and should have been quite a sight for the people there. Who was this guy? We think it was him. We found his inscription, which fits rather nicely with this narrative. Actually, you can see by at the end. There are very few options for this, and we discussed that with John Patterson, a colleague of mine. His name was actually Anoptes, which means invisible. Okay? It's a typical, it's the Roman way of making fun of slaves, I think. It was a freedman, but someone that a freedman would write his name in letters like this. So very happy to celebrate his former status at being now freed by a very important family, the Sulpici Galbae. They will give an emperor, short-lived emperor, but they were kind of a very, very influential family along the Tyrrhenian coast. They own very many properties, and it wouldn't surprise me, especially Minturno, they are very well attested, if because of their link with trade, they had some interest in securing some of the space in those warehouses in Interamna. Corruption was rampant. They didn't call it like that, they call it patronage. And this guy is making a gift of a wonderful scena to the theater. Now, the other interesting aspect of this is that despite being a covered theater, we do have these halls. I don't know if you ever noticed and ever wonder what are these halls along the stage of Roman theater. They are the halls for the auleum. The auleum is the curtain. Actually, it shouldn't go like this. It goes like so, and it goes from bottom up. So what you have are slots. You have some vertical elements made of wood, which are tied at the bottom with a rope. You have a system of pulleys. They pulled it, the stick, go up, and they're all tied with textile embroidery. And that's the way of signaling the start and the end of acts, play, etc. To the point that in their own way of saying, when something was about to start, they would say the curtain now goes down, which is quite the opposite of what we do today. And the reason, and we were lucky because we not only found the holes, but we found the remains of, they're not really combined, they're taken from different angles, but of these two features here, you see the slot for the winch that was pulling the cables. Now, to me, it's quite interesting because it tells you something that even though they were developing a new architectural type, which actually comes and was copied from Greek models of Bouleuteria, the assembly hall for the councils of Greek towns, which tells you that these people need to know about that and the advantages of this sort of architectural type. When someone can say, maybe we can make it fall from above. Say, no, doesn't make any sense. Of course it has to be coming from below. So it's a unique theater. There are many theaters in this region. Every single town has one. This is the only one that has been roofed. It's a statement that has been made by this community about it. They're exceptional in many respects. And the fact that they know about the latest fashions, they either hired an architect who knew, or architects who knew what they were doing, or they went there with a clear idea of what they wanted. And I think that this, as we were discussing many years ago with Martin, probably this worked as an assembly hall for political assemblies of the Curia, of the local senate, because if you go to Paestum, you find a very similar building along the forum. And this part here of a theater is known as locus senatorius. These are the seats reserved for the members of the local senate, of the Curia, the decuriones. Well, nobody prevented these people from meeting there when there was no play as a Curia, which is what has been suggested for the case of Paestum. Modeled on what? On the Greek Eleutheria. Again, these people traveled the web, or at least talked with people who traveled. The basilica is next to the theater and is separated by a monumental road. Now, I call it monumental road because the blocks are so big. They are basically the same quality as the parallel of the theater, same quality, same material, same style. And there are no signs of cars passing by. So no traffic whatsoever except pedestrians, to the point that we think this was more of a connective tissue between the two structures and possibly an extension of the forum, which is here. Now, only partly excavated. We know the plan from the geophysical survey. You can tell that it fits. Not very big. The middle space, the medium spatium, is 15 by 10 meters. And we have a double colonnade on the front. How does that compare to other examples that we know about? Well, the double colonnade on the front, well, we have it from Cosa, for example, already mentioned that town, another Latin colony. We do have a double colonnade in many respects in Pompeii as well. Now, if you read your Vitruvius, it will tell you that sometimes along the side of the forum, you may want to put a vestibule, a calcinicum, which is probably what this is. Now, this is contemporary with the writings of, I'm not saying that they were copying Vitruvius, I'm not saying I'm sure you understand what I mean. But you also know that recently they found what they think are the remains of the actual Vitruvian Basilica in Fam. It's pretty impressive. At first, I didn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. But having gone through the thing, now I'm pretty sold on that. Now, it doesn't really resemble, there are some differences. But the thing that I want to bring home about this is that Pierre Gros originally, based on the description of Vitruvius, suggested that the space between the columns, the intercolumnium, was not regular, which sounds weird, and is exactly what we see in Interamna as well. And it is exactly what they found when they dug, what they think are the remains. So I think this defied expectation, and until until my sabbatical, really, I never really bothered measuring it and finding that there is a significant, 40 centimeters of difference in the layout. Now, okay, vestibule, the middle space, the basilica, if for those of you who may not remember, is a civic building. It's not like the Christian basilica later on. It's not the temple. It's not the church. It's primarily a polyfunctional building for administration of justice, but also other things. They would probably section the space with wooden panels of some kind, so that different activities could take place at the same time. The one element of coherence is that the distance of the columns from the sides, where you don't see any semicolon continuing this kind of pattern, is regular, which made me think that perhaps that these two elements are different from each other and should be reconstructed in a different way. That is where I hope to get some nice feedback. If you're wondering about this thing here, we think that this is a portico. Originally, I thought of the Urban Basilica. Unlikely, because actually we have a series of walls of a house underneath. So it's something else. The columns, they have 24 flutes with the cable in the center, as you would expect at the base of the column. They're made of brickwork with a thick layer of stucco. Cheap, effective, quick, very Roman. The floor, however, is a second phase because covers the base of these columns. Now, to my dismay, as I was redoing this, when we found this is one of the columns here in the front. And I always said, well, yeah, probably there was some stairway that they had to, align this little brickwork with, but basically we should expect a full column. And then, if you look very carefully, this column is not really aligned with the foundation, it's a bit off. So actually this wall is very much in line with the foundation. So actually what we have here is a semi-column and a plain surface on the outside. Now, sorry, before I say that, this kind of super work in progress is the equivalent of playing with the wooden blocks of my son when he was 3. Okay, so you're very welcome to make fun of that, but it's just myself trying to, these are very early stages of trying to play with the volumes and try to understand how displays may have worked out and look before I start adding actual measures. But I think that it would have had quite a plain surface. They may have wanted to give a bit more prominence in terms of accesses to this, whether you want to play arches or not. I don't know. 5 minutes before I came here, there were arches here. And then I said, well, I don't know. Whether we want to have a full, another story on top, that depends on what you want to make. The foundations are pretty big. And there's a strong pilaster that could have probably supported, but I need to do my calculations right before I suggest that. From the inside, you would have this nice place, nice space with, a vestibule at the center, the spatum medium, and the corridor on the side, which I think, is coherent enough to be something. Could there have been a second story here, like in the description of a basilica in Vitruvius? Maybe, maybe not. We didn't find any evidence of a stairway. Stairway can also be made of wood. It's not a very impressive building in terms of, architectural ambition, maybe, I don't know, maybe then, something less complicated. But on the basis of the evidence that I have at the moment, I cannot tell. What I can tell is that they date to the same time. They're part of the same development. And that is more or less contemporary with someone was starting his career in the Senate in Rome. Is a moment in which they rejuvenate the forum. And I get to the conclusion, because there is some continued vitality in this town. And here we have an inscription, and talking about texts and archaeology. Here, these are 2 inscriptions referring to 2 members of the same family. And what is interesting is that this family, the Senti, is probably not even from Interamna. It's from nearby, in the same way as the Panoptus was a freedman from probably Minturnu. But they're putting money in it, and they're restoring the baths. Probably they were built by their family earlier on. There's thermas extivas, this summer baths apparently. What is interesting about the first of these gentlemen is that this inscription dates to probably 3rd, 4th century AD. It says that because of what he did, there is another one, sorry. This dates to 408. There is another one of an earlier member of his family. Actually, he says, is given the right of a Bisellium in the theatre, which tells you that the theatre was still in place and operating probably in the 3rd or 4th century AD. But this one we're very lucky because it gives you a date, the consular date, right? 408, that's pretty late. An act of benefaction by this gentleman here that basically paid for the restoration of the bath that we know from the earlier inscription. The earlier ancestors had built a porticus around a column, around a swimming pool. Okay. We found it. Well, you think we found it because we have, of the 3 bath complexes, we have one with what looks like a swimming pool surrounded by a portico. And where is it? Still very near to the area that still at that time was in use. Don't be fooled by the language of the description. Oh, everything has been falling apart. Were it not for this gift, we wouldn't have. Because it's rhetoric. You find it all the time in this sort of description. Had it not for the benefactor, nothing would have happened. Now, so what? I've taken 45 minutes of your life for what? A Roman town featuring the range of buildings which I mentioned is utterly surprising. I don't think they will call home saying, oh, you know what I discovered today? They had theatres. But it is entirely unexpected for Interamna Lirenas for long considered little more than a sleepy backwater village, a town-only name, as I said, and provides a concrete testimony of the fact that towns at any level were integrated in and part of a sprawling network through which things, through trade, but also people and ideas, because things were not moving by themselves, moved and spread, reaching small places, perhaps at the margins of the network, like in Interamna. And the things and ideas that move along included the language of urbanism and architecture, of Roman urbanism and architecture, that was deployed in the case of Interamna, and possibly elsewhere, and likely elsewhere as well, at crucial points in the town's development in order to convey a sense of itself. Something that we are very lucky at Interamna, we can fully contextualize and appreciate only because we have a uniquely comprehensive understanding of this small town. Ask yourself at the end of the presentation, what would change if the plan wasn't there? What if the only thing we knew was this? Would that be affected? I think and I hope that it would be in a bad way. What I hope to have shown today by providing a glimpse of what a site like Interamna can offer is how wide and deep was the reach of that language across the Roman world, and putting in contact areas like the East with southern Lazio, and what the study of this language can contribute to our understanding of the Roman world, its political, social, economic, and cultural development.